again, a state is responsible for the actions of private entities.
Right.
And so I'm not so sure that Mr. Musk would be dictating the terms of the laws in outer space as much as countries and nation states would be doing that.
Yeah.
So is there a concern? Yes, and that's what we have to work through. It's like when we were building the ISS and we were trying to determine criminal jurisdiction for ISS. It was one of the more difficult topics because you have countries that have differing laws on how to handle criminal activity.
Right.
And then, like you mentioned, every module is the jurisdiction of all those different countries as well. So what do you do when there's a U.S. astronaut in a Japanese module and say the U.S. astronaut is hurt by a Japanese astronaut?
Welcome to Emphasis Added, a podcast by the Houston Law Review, where we highlight legal issues with prominent lawyers and discuss the study and practice of law. I'm your host, Kevin Donovan. I'm here today with NASA attorney and UHLC space law professor Rebecca Bresnik to talk about the privatization of space and the legal issues surrounding the rising prominence of private companies in the space industry. Welcome to the show, Rebecca.
Thanks, Kevin. And I'm really excited to be here today and excited to really talk about all these amazing new activities that are going on, both in low Earth orbit, beyond low Earth orbit, and like I said, all of these new companies that are entering into the space industry.
That's great. But before we get into all that, I know I'm wondering, and I think a lot of our listeners are probably wondering, what it's like to be a NASA attorney. And so just wondering, you've worked for NASA for over 16 years. What does a NASA attorney do, and what's your current role on NASA's legal team?
So my current role at NASA is I'm lead for international law for the Johnson Space Center. With that, I don't have a set type of work that I do. My work changes from day to day, but as you know, NASA has the International Space Station, and the International Space Station program is set out of Johnson Space Center. So we've got partners such as the Japanese, the Europeans, the Russians, and the Canadians. So to make the ISS work, we have all these different agreements and obligations to one another. And so a big portion of my day is ensuring that, working some of those agreements, ensuring that we are following our agreements, negotiating agreements. Also, very recently, we negotiated a new agreement with the Europeans, Japanese, and Canadians for a new platform that's outside of low Earth orbit called Gateway. And Gateway will actually orbit in the halo orbit around the moon. And Gateway will then be the first stop for our astronauts to go to before they go and step on the moon.
Oh, wow. That is really interesting.
And then some of my other activities are contracts. We enter into contracts with a lot of our international entities. For a long time, we had a contract with the Russians to buy Soyuz transportation seats to get to the International Space Station. As you know, after the shuttle, we had no transportation system, and it wasn't until SpaceX more recently got their vehicles up and going to provide transportation to ISS that we were only capable of getting to the ISS via the Russians. And then we also have the Boeing vehicle that will be coming on fairly soon as well.
Oh, that's really interesting. So private companies were the U.S.'s first way of moving, like just strictly from the U.S. astronauts to space without other countries?
So Boeing and SpaceX will be these private companies that the U.S. will. So the U.S. the U.S. doesn't own the vehicles. The U.S. only buys the service, and that's exactly it. The service is being purchased now from a commercial provider as opposed to NASA taking complete ownership of the vehicle. So it's
interesting.
And then it's a model though where it's the NASA astronauts that are flying the vehicles, so not necessarily a taxi cab model.
It's like Uber, but you drive the car.
Yes, Uber, but you drive the car. There you go. I don't know if I'd try that on Earth. I'm not sure if they'd let you do that, but
It wouldn't surprise me though. It wouldn't surprise me if Tesla made its own Uber, where people did go in and the car drove you, but you were still in the driver. I'm just saying. I think it's coming.
Well, speaking of Tesla,
Uh-huh.
so SpaceX's vehicle, their space vehicle,
Okay.
their Dragon,
Which is a cool name.
is supposed to be a bit more autonomous, and they will have the capability where professional astronauts may not need to be necessarily on the vehicle for the vehicle to then go into space. So they are building their vehicle to where it doesn't necessarily need a professional astronaut. And there's some really good examples. So Inspiration 4, I don't know if you've heard about that in the news, but it's a flight where it's going to be on a SpaceX vehicle.
Okay.
The 4 people on the vehicle will not be professional astronauts. They
Interesting.
will go beyond the ISS in a loop. I think it's a 3-day mission, possibly longer. And this will be a mission, like I said, where there's no professional astronauts.
Now, would this be also utilized for like space tourism and those sorts of things?
Yes. So SpaceX vehicles won't be just for the government to purchase, but
Okay.
exactly what you said. Their vehicles will be used for space tourism. So a really good example of that is here in Houston, there's a company called Axiom. Axiom purchased a SpaceX vehicle, and they will use that vehicle, and they entered an agreement with NASA to bring their private astronauts up to the ISS. So they bought a commercial vehicle.
Okay.
They'll have their own astronauts on it, and they, like I said, entered in a deal with NASA. Well, they'll come up to the International Space Station for a short duration, probably about a 10-day mission or so. So another really good example where space vehicles aren't just being used any longer by the government, but also by private entities.
Interesting. I think when I was preparing for this, I was looking up like what people were charging for tickets for just like the common person to hop on. I want to say Virgin Galactic, it was like $250,000 for a ride.
So Virgin Galactic's only suborbital. I don't want to say only suborbital,
Only.
but it's not going up.
And what is suborbital? Like how many miles or kilometers or I mean, and that might be an unfair question.
It's suborbital.
Okay.
It's not. It's not.
You're not like.
No, it's not. It's into space, but it's not into low Earth orbit like the ISS is.
Okay, got
So.
it. Hey, interesting. Okay. Well, I have a lot of questions, a lot of follow-ups, but I don't want to go to them just yet because I want to lay the stage here and just ask a very general question. I mean, you're a space law professor, so I think you probably have a pretty general answer to this. And a lot of our listeners probably don't know, what is space law?
Yeah, so space law, normally when you go to a law school class, you're thinking, I'm going to learn about contracts, and everything I need to know is in that one contracts book. Or I'm going to learn about constitutional law, and it's a very concentrated area. You know where to look for it. It's this one area of the law. The interesting thing about space law, when you say you're a space lawyer, a lot depends on, okay, what area and what area am I practicing, and who is my client? So if it's a company and you're a space lawyer, maybe you're doing primarily transactional work, contracts, setting up, whatever transactions you need for that company. Maybe you're helping set up a spaceport. But as a government space lawyer, my job more is to do we do a lot of transactional work, a lot of contracts, but I also need to understand international law. I need to understand the different treaties that govern space. I know you had some questions in here regarding some more, I think we'll touch on some of those treaties. There's 4 major treaties. But again, it's a very interdisciplinary area. So I would probably do a lot with regards to export control because we're dealing with international partners. So it's not just one area of the law. It's taking many different areas of the law and being able to use them to do, whatever it is that that action item is that comes across my desk. So, for instance, buying a Soyuz seat, that I would need to know contracts, I'd need to know export control laws, I would need to know whatever restrictions there are with buying from a foreign entity. So again, it's fiscal law issues as well. So, yeah.
Interesting. And so, yeah, I absolutely want to talk about those treaties because they seem like a pretty important factor in probably a lot of the things we're going to talk about. And I guess maybe to see kind of how those weave in and everything first, and to shift towards the privatization of space, I'd like to kind of talk about like near Earth things that are occurring, the things that are occurring here and now. So you've already kind of mentioned some of the space tourism or having private astronauts go into space, that, and as well as satellites. I mean, I guess the first thing I think is what happens when say a satellite gets launched or one of these spaceships gets launched from a country. I mean, whose laws govern that aircraft when it's in space?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. And normally, so you look at your treaties, and the Outer Space Treaty, the Registration Convention, and there's also the Liability Convention. It's the launching state that is liable. Okay. So you have responsibility and you have liability. Liability, like I said, it depends on the launching state. The launching state can be 4 different entities, though, so it does get confusing. It could be the state that launches, the state that procures a launch, or it can be the state from where the launch happened, or the state who owns the facility from where a launch occurs. So it could be all 4 entities. It could be all 4 entities. But then, in addition to liability, you also have responsibility. And the very, very unique thing about space is a state takes on the responsibility for not just the government activities that occur in outer space, but also all the activities that their private entities do in outer space. So our government takes responsibility for the actions of private entities in space.
That is interesting.
Nice.
And that's completely different than if a private actor were to say, I don't know, a U.S. company does actions in Europe and they, crash one of their trucks into another truck or something like that. That's completely, the U.S. isn't going to be involved in that at all. But here in space.
Yeah. So you also asked too who still owns that. The Outer Space Treaty does say, though, in Article 8, that the state from where that satellite is launched to the jurisdiction will continue to be whatever from wherever that launch has occurred. So if you launch from the U.S., that spacecraft, even though it enters into space, will still be under the jurisdiction of the United States. So similar to a ship. A ship, once it leaves, even though it's on the high seas, it will continue to be under the jurisdiction of whatever country the flag on the ship says.
But if it's, say, a Japanese mission that, like, hypothetically launches from Texas, is that more likely because it's a Japanese procured mission going to be under Japanese law and jurisdiction and responsibility?
So if there's more than 2 launching states, the 2 launching states will determine who registers it.
Ah.
So they'll determine
they figure
that.
it out.
And most of the time
beforehand. Not
yes,
after something
you
occurs.
hope they figure out beforehand, and you hope that they actually register. Not all things are properly registered before they launch into space, and we have had issues with that as well.
Okay. Yeah, and I do want to ask about the registration as well, but just kind of curious. So all of these laws have been around for a while, right? I mean, the space activity and the treaties kind of all occurred, back in the space race of the Cold War, right?
60s and 70s primarily, yes. So well over 50 years ago.
So it is time-tested law. But I guess not in the fact that because private actors haven't really been as busy, at least not since then, right?
Yeah, so that's actually a really good observation. So while the Outer Space Treaty has been, it's been around since 1967, a lot of the newer activities have only occurred in the past, 5 years or so with regards to commercial activities. So you are absolutely correct. So a lot of these new questions that are coming up have people asking, well, is the Outer Space Treaty outdated? Does it cover all of these newer activities? And I think most people would say yes. Currently, the Outer Space Treaty still adequately covers the activities of what we're doing today, but I think some of the interpretations now of the Outer Space Treaty, whereas we weren't really too concerned about the interpretations because the activities weren't occurring. So a really good example is whether or not there is private ownership of resources extracted from, say, the lunar surface.
Okay.
So the Outer Space Treaty was a bit ambiguous about that. And, there's arguments back and forth of whether or not it was ambiguous, but it says there can be no national appropriation of the moon or any celestial body. So national appropriation of a planet, well, okay, so you can't own a planet, you can't own property, but it really never spoke to whether or not you could own the resources. But then there was an argument saying, well, no, outer space is for the benefit of all mankind, for the use of all mankind, so how could there be private ownership if it's for the benefit of all mankind?
Yeah.
But then the other argument is well, no, the Outer Space Treaty was silent, so it doesn't necessarily say that you can't, so you can. But then there's the other argument, well, it says no national appropriation, so if a country can't own, then how can a private entity own property? And then the argument then in return is, well, it's not property, it's resources being extracted. So that was actually something that was just there were very, a lot of law review articles written about it, very hypothetical.
Yeah.
But it's no longer hypothetical now
Right.
because of all of these new activities that are taking place and being proposed.
I was going to wait to talk about that, but I think
Oh,
this is a
sorry.
great time. No, I think this is a great time to talk about this because, I mean, what you're talking about right now appears to be kind of the competing views of, one, the Artemis Accords, and then also maybe the Moon Treaty, right? And kind of, so NASA right now has the Artemis program, which has the goal of returning humans to the moon for the first time in decades. But with that comes a new governing set of rules. And I think that set of rules is the Artemis Accords, right? Which takes one of those sides of interpreting the Outer Space Treaty. Is that right?
So I think the Artemis Accords, before we get to the Artemis Accords, I would say what the United States actually did in 2015, it actually put out a law stating, and it was the Space Act of 2015, stating that U.S. entities could own extracted resources from a celestial body, including asteroids.
Okay.
That caused a lot of controversy, but in that, it said it had to be consistent with international law and their international treaty obligations.
Okay.
So the U.S. took the position that there could be private ownership.
Right.
And then later on, statements came out by the U.S. government, in particular the State Department, where they said, well, space is for the use of all mankind, and to make it to be for the use of all mankind, that, allowing for the capability to extract resources is a part of that use.
Right.
And once you extract the resource from the land, it's no longer a part of the land, and you can actually take ownership of it. And then in early 1920, so it was April of 1920, an executive order also came out saying that the United States, again, believes in the fact that they can own resources and U.S. citizens can own resources, and they basically bolstering that 2015 law, as well as saying, we do not believe in that the Moon Treaty actually establishes customary international law. So you brought up the Moon Treaty.
Yes.
The Moon Treaty, that says that you cannot own, that private entities cannot take ownership of resources extracted. Instead, what they're saying is the extraction has to be under basically an international regime, and then that international regime will then determine how those resources are parsed out.
And I would find that to be kind of concerning if I was a private company trying to make money.
So you are exactly right. So how do
I'm just going to hand these things over to somebody, and they're going to just decide who gets them.
You are exactly correct.
Yeah.
So how do you get companies motivated to do
Right.
these activities in space? And if they can't take ownership and profit, then they are not going to be motivated to go in space and to do these activities. They
Right.
have to have some sort of return on the, going into space is expensive. The real expense really is the transportation costs.
Right.
So they needed to know, hey, there's a return for me to invest all of this money and to actually get investors to want to invest in these activities.
Right.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. That's capitalism works.
Yeah, but capitalism works, but it's not without restrictions. Again,
Right.
that law did specifically state that we would still follow all of our obligations under the Outer Space Treaty and all of the other treaties that we have obligations to. So it wasn't.
So we're still not going to be putting flags down on the moon and claiming swaths of land.
No.
It's just when the resource is extracted, that's owned, but not necessarily like the area itself.
And even the resources being extracted, it's not that a private entity is going to be able to go up there without our government having a say of what the activity is. Because remember I said space is very unique in that the state has the responsibility not just for government activities but for private activities.
Right.
And like here in the United States, before a private entity goes into space, they have to get a license to launch.
Yeah.
Before they partake in certain activities in space, they have to get licenses as well through FAA.
Okay.
And so those activities that they want to do in space, it's not going to be some sort of free for all. Again, the Outer Space Treaty says that states have the obligation to authorize and continually supervise activities in space. So we also have that obligation as well with regards to all the other signatories of the Outer Space Treaty.
Okay. But I guess, there's this debate, or not debate, I guess, but, there's this competing views about what are we going to do with these private resources. And it definitely begs the question, like, why are property rights so important over these resources in space? I mean, what is out there that everyone's so concerned about? I mean, isn't it just a bunch of rock?
Okay, so you're asking a lawyer. You're not asking a scientist.
Yep.
So let me keep this in very simple terms.
Yes, that's what we like here. We like simple terms.
But I think one important resource that's been talked about, and you've probably heard about, is helium-3. So helium-3 is and I may get this
Something
wrong.
like nuclear,
it's
right?
Yeah, it's an isotope, but it doesn't have the same dangers that, say, a nuclear power plant would have.
Okay.
And if you could extract a truckload of helium-3, it could be used to power, say, New York City for months on end.
Interesting.
So
Just one truckload.
So helium-3. And then also ice. So ice is water.
Okay. Yep.
So, and from water you get what? Hydrogen and oxygen.
Yeah.
Which from that you can get rocket fuel.
Okay.
So
I was going to say the ability to survive, but But that's also important because the ability to return and travel. Right?
Yeah, and so if you can find a way to make rocket fuel on the lunar surface, you can then do launches from the lunar surface, which is much easier than doing launches from the United States or from Earth. I shouldn't be just particularly United States. From Earth and getting through the Earth's atmosphere, because that is the huge cost of traveling in space. Like I said, it's transportation.
Right.
So if you can start your launch from the lunar surface where you don't have that gravity pull, it's much, much cheaper to do launches and to explore space.
Interesting. So let me get this right, because I didn't even think about this when I was kind of researching, and people were talking about making rocket fuel and stuff. But what you're saying is, I mean, because we're already going to have a satellite floating around the moon. That's in the works, right? And then people are going to be able to then shoot from the moon to other, say to Mars or something, and it's going to require a lot less rocket fuel than shooting from Earth because you don't have the gravitational pull, you don't have everything to push away from. Right? I mean, that's...
Yeah, exactly. And then
Huh.
and then even some crazier ideas. So what about solar energy?
Yeah.
If you can take a solar panel and you direct it to the Earth and you put it on a location in the moon where the sun is always hitting, and find a way to direct it back to the Earth, that could be solar power that's 24/7.
Interesting.
So there's a lot of unique resources, and it's just the technology know-how, the money, and the capability to be able to use those resources.
Wow. That is really fascinating. I guess to bring us not back to Earth, but to bring us closer to Earth, I wanted to talk a little bit about satellites because I think they're such a big part of everybody's life. It's probably maybe affected the most by space. I mean, to just to figure out like where to park today, I had pulled up a satellite image of the school.
The iPhone.
And looked at it. Yeah. I mean, just to drive anywhere, you've got GPS going. And so I think there's currently like thousands of active satellites orbiting the Earth, but with the prominence of private companies entering the space industry, especially with like these internet satellite constellations, there's going to be, I think Starlight, SpaceX's company, and Amazon and these other companies have talked about pushing tens of thousands of satellites in the next decade. And so just last week, OneWeb, a United Kingdom's internet satellite constellation company, accused SpaceX of having a near collision with one of their Starlink satellites. It didn't happen, but I guess it raises the question, and I think you've already kind of talked about it a little bit, but how are these satellites tracked and regulated, and is anyone overseeing this part of Earth's orbit to make sure that these sorts of things don't occur?
Yeah, so I think that there's two issues there. First, you asked who tracks the satellites, and that's U.S. Space Command, and that's actually now, as I understand, it's under Space Force, so that's the Air Force, now Space Force, that does the tracking with their Deep Space Network tracking system. But it's difficult. There's a lot out there. There's other nations as well that does tracking also, so that's not the only entity that does tracking, and countries do share information.
Okay.
But I think that the big second issue, though, is management of what is in space. And that has been such a prominent question currently with the past administration. I'm guessing it's going to be possibly taken on by the current administration, of how do you manage what's in space? Who manages what's in space? There were talks about possibly FAA doing it. There was support in the last administration with the Department of Commerce taking over that role. Currently, we do not have an entity that does that. The other difficult thing is, so if you have a collision of two satellites and you're trying to determine, well, who's responsible? Who's liable for that?
Yeah.
So you have the liability convention, and the liability convention says, well, when you have two satellites crash or you have damage caused in outer space, you use what's called fault liability.
Okay.
So who's ever at fault?
Uh-huh.
But the question is, well, who is at fault if you have no rules of the road?
Yeah, and if both these things are just floating, around out there.
Exactly. So, in addition to management of what's out there, we need some sort of set rules of who's responsible to do what in certain circumstances. So that's also something else that's missing right now in our legal regime of outer space.
What would happen if, say two different country satellites collide? Because it's happened in the past, right? At least one other time, or?
It has. The liability convention wasn't used. You would look at fault, but who's at fault? Mm-hmm. And that's the difficulty. And so, one entity would have to show that the other entity's at fault. It's a little difficult to determine who's at fault when you're in outer space. So if you have a satellite that's defunct and another one that's not, who has the responsibility to move out of the way? Mm-hmm. There are no rules that say one person has to move out of the way if they can, or the other one that's defunct, do they need to go up and grab their satellite and and deorbit it, or
Right.
so because you don't have those rules, it's really difficult to figure out fault.
Interesting.
So a lot of those companies, if they're smart, they have very good insurance coverage.
That's always the solution when the law isn't
Insurance,
sure.
or and parties I would guess also would settle as well.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
And so I guess in a hypothetical where satellites were to crash, or even just generally, like, you're going to have space debris. I think the European Space Agency has estimated there's millions of pieces of space debris floating around in the orbit. I mean, not all of them are big, but I think they said like tens of thousands or over like 10 centimeters in size. And I know the movie Gravity, I think in the beginning it shows like the catastrophic worst case scenario where space debris is just flying
everywhere.
at hundreds of miles an hour, hitting satellites, breaking things apart. And while that's the worst case scenario, I think just even in the less worst case scenario of just there being all this debris around, I mean, it seems to be problematic. And so I wonder, who, if anyone's responsible for cleaning it up?
Yeah, so that's actually another very good question. So for cleaning up, there are no rules right now.
Okay.
What countries have done, and actually NASA and the United States really being the beginning force of putting forth some debris mitigation guidelines, and other countries have done that as well. There's an interagency working group also of all the different space agencies that work together on how to mitigate debris. The UN has also taken this on. So it's not that it's an issue that's being completely ignored, but the problem is you have to get all of these countries to agree how you're going to mitigate the debris.
Yeah.
And then if you're talking about who's responsible for removing debris, well, how do you determine that? Is it by a percentage of how much a country puts up into space? Is it, who pays for that? Because the expense would be pretty great.
I mean, it's like trying to solve pollution problems internationally.
Exactly. No, that's
tough
actually
to do.
That's a really good analogy. Absolutely. Yeah.
And so, I mean, right now, say the U.S. wanted to clean up debris, say like caused by like a Chinese satellite or something. I mean, do we have to ask for permission? Can we clean it up because it's pieces of debris floating around? And is anyone even going to care? Do these things happen?
Yeah. So, who owns that piece of space debris?
I mean, I would assume if it's from the launching state, then it's still their debris.
It's their debris. So
are we like trespassing on their territory by taking that debris? And
that's exactly the legal issue. So what is a space object, and how do you define space debris?
Yeah.
So you have some really good rules of the road of what you can do when a ship has been left at sea, and someone can go fix it. And if they put the money into it, they can then actually then own the ship.
Okay.
But up in space, you don't have those same rules. So again, who owns it? And we don't have a really good definition of space debris.
Yeah.
And so if we went and took a piece of space debris, I always say what is one man's junk is another man's treasure.
Yeah.
So, hey, the Chinese could come back and say, that's my satellite. That's a piece of my satellite. And
yeah, that metal's expensive.
Yeah.
I mean,
or
the tech in it.
Or exactly. If you take a piece that they are concerned about, and you don't want to do that because if they do it in return, I don't think we would appreciate it either. So
right. Yeah.
But again, too, it's the expense of it as well. Would we really take on the expense to start removing Chinese debris?
Well, what about in the U.S.? I mean, we already have some companies that are pushing out these internet satellite constellations. I'm assuming, not to go super into who gets authorization, but I'm assuming there's going to be a company that's going to put a bunch of satellites into space that's going to go bankrupt. And in this instance where somebody doesn't buy all the satellites and there's just these unclaimed satellites floating around orbit, I mean, in that instance, what happens? I mean, does the U.S. take responsibility and clean those up, or do we take liability if they crash into something else? Does the country have to assume that?
So, again, another very good question.
Sorry.
So there was a company recently that did go bankrupt.
Okay.
It was a UK-based company, but it filed bankruptcy in the United States.
Interesting.
In that circumstance, though, the bank took ownership, resold the company. So in an
Okay.
instance where you'd have a company that has those types of assets, have a bunch of
Yeah.
satellites,
Someone's going to want that.
somebody is going to want that. They are going to resell that company to keep the company going.
Okay.
And the company would then own those satellites. Now, but the interesting thing is if you, so in that instance, the UK government took ownership of those satellites. But you raised a really good question. So the launching state, depending on who the launching state is or the launching entity, could you transfer ownership or could you transfer who the launching state is up in space? So that is a really good question. And I don't think I have the perfect answer for you.
That's good, though. The unanswered questions are interesting questions,
Yes,
I think.
they are. They're good exam questions.
Yeah, exactly. That's really cool. Well, to talk about something that I think is absolutely in your wheelhouse because you are NASA's top attorney for the International Space Station, I think we had talked at one point about private astronauts going to the International Space Station. And so I'd wonder, kind of in the International Space Station, right, it's a conglomeration of different countries, I don't know, spacecraft or something like that, right?
Yeah, they're modules.
Yeah, they're modules.
Yeah.
And so what happens with these private astronauts when they're walking throughout the International Space Station, or they go and they do something in one of the other modules? I mean, does it shift? They're in that jurisdiction and then they're in a different jurisdiction?
Yeah, so we are currently preparing for our first U.S. private astronaut mission to take place, possibly in the 2021 timeframe,
Okay.
2022 timeframe.
Very cool.
And we are actually dealing with these issues right now. So as you mentioned, the partners of the ISS, they all agreed that they would register their own modules. And by registering their own modules, they individually then have jurisdiction of their modules. So you are in the ESA module, you're in European jurisdiction, you're in the JAXA module, you're in Japanese jurisdiction.
Okay.
And now for purposes of the ISS, the partners, though, also agreed that the different partners would actually retain jurisdiction over their astronauts, even if the astronauts themselves were in a partner's module. So even though our astronauts in the module of the Japanese, we would still retain jurisdiction over the actual astronaut,
Okay.
although they would be in Japanese jurisdiction.
Interesting.
So the same.
Yeah.
So for private astronauts, it would be very similar.
Got it.
So private astronauts go up, they'll be floating, and it is pretty cool to think that you're in European jurisdiction, and the European module is of many European countries, so it's not just one.
Yeah.
And then you float through, and all of a sudden you're in Japanese jurisdiction.
Right.
So while it's cool, it does actually have its legal challenges as well, depending on what you're working on. So.
Well, imagine in space, I mean, you've got like scientists and engineers, right? I mean, with a ton of time on their hands. And so, I imagine they're like inventing things and creating things. I mean, I personally, as a law student, I don't know a lot about intellectual property, but I mean, is that like their creations and inventions of things is where there are in the International Space Station dictate like what, even those laws that, you know?
So the IP laws, I'm not an IP
Okay.
attorney. We have much smarter attorneys that talk IP stuff. But so IP is similar as well, where
Okay.
even though they may be in the module of, say, they were in the European module and they invent something,
Yeah.
the invention stays with the person that
That did it.
did it.
Okay.
Exactly.
Got it. Okay.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
Yeah,
That seems
it
fair.
does.
Just
Well, and
what we hope laws do.
Well, and that makes sense too, because if you think about the ISS, it's made up of all these different modules that do different things, and particularly, so the Americans, the U.S., Canadians, Japanese, and Europeans, we all share those modules.
Right.
That's 50. We have 50% of the ISS that
Okay.
we share. The other 50% is the Russian segment of ISS.
Okay.
So the fact that we are all sharing each other's modules to do different things, it would make sense that you would have that type of law or that type of agreement where if we're doing our own experiments, but it's on the Japanese or the ESA module, that we can still keep IP rights to whatever we invent.
Before we continue, a special thanks to our sponsor, Vincent & Elkins, a global law firm with 11 offices and more than 700 lawyers committed to excellence in serving and advising its sophisticated clients in industries such as energy, finance, technology, real estate, media, and beyond. V&E lawyers are also proud to support pro bono clients across their communities. To help clients navigate complex areas of law, V&E hires the best and brightest law students and lawyers, valuing diverse perspectives and backgrounds. Visit www.velaw.com to learn more about V&E's Summer Associate Program and hiring opportunities. Start your success story at Vincent & Elkins. I mean, it's fascinating. I mean, you're going to have, especially just the future, thinking about like private astronauts and...
Yeah, private astronauts, and it's not just to ISS. You've got private astronaut missions and companies that are talking about building their own modules that will float, and very high-end modules where their private astronauts will go to these private modules for short durations, long durations. Hopefully these modules could also do some sort of science as well. And then I don't know if you also saw this past week too, the Chinese actually launched their the first part of the beginning of their space station.
Okay.
Yeah.
So that there will be multiple space stations now.
Yeah. So, and I mentioned too, we were going to have the new station that's going to orbit the moon.
Yeah.
Now that's going to be a little different though than ISS. The ISS is like a 5-bedroom home.
Right.
The Gateway will be more a 1-bedroom apartment.
Okay.
And whereas the ISS is continually manned, Gateway, at least for the initial flights, they'll be probably once a year as opposed to being continually manned, but still a lot of science taking place up there on Gateway, but more robotic.
And I can't remember if you mentioned this. Is there any sort of time frame for when we can think to look for a satellite orbiting the moon? I doubt we'll be able to see it, right?
So satellite orbiting, you mean the
Gateway.
the platform? So
Yeah.
so Gateway, that is being built right now.
Okay.
Again, that's an international partnership, and we are supposed to start launching those modules fairly soon, within the next couple of years,
Okay.
to have that built within the 2024 time frame. And then, we've heard the news, we want to get back to the moon by the 2024 time frame.
Yeah.
We'll see if it's 2024, 2025, but anywhere from 2024,
but still within our
that
lifetime.
time frame.
Within
our lifetime, yes.
Yeah, I mean, it's just, I think a lot of these things, if I had heard about it 10 years ago, I'd have been like, oh, I hope I get to see that someday. And it seems like it's just everything has accelerated very, very quickly in the past decade. And maybe it hasn't. Maybe NASA, and these companies have known that this has been the timeline. But for me, as somebody uninvolved, it all seems like it's happening so fast.
Well, it makes sense, though. And a lot of people say, why are you going back to the moon? We've done that. We've been there, done that. But we've never gone back to the moon with a continual and constant presence.
Right.
So when you, for example, go on a camping trip, are you going to set up your tent for the first time on your camping trip?
I would hope I would set it up in the backyard.
Are
at
you
least
going
once.
to? Are you going to try your equipment out for the first time? Your hiking boots out for the first time when you're on the hike? No,
Yeah.
you're going to break them in.
Right.
So it's the same idea with going to the moon. Okay, we want to go to Mars.
Yeah.
Which is great.
Right.
But let's figure out how to have a sustainable presence on the moon, and figure out how to do things on the moon before we go beyond the moon. You can bring your astronauts home much quicker from the moon than you can Mars. And, it is lives at stake, so you do want to make sure that you are getting this right. So,
Right.
Everything from manufacturing capabilities to living to science to health issues, all of that. I mean, that's why you have the ISS. The ISS is what gave us the science you're living and working in space.
Yeah.
So from there, you go to the moon, living and working in space, not just going for a couple of days and coming back, but going and staying.
Right.
And then that's what gives you the information that you need to go even further, say to Mars.
And that's exactly what I want to talk about next.
Mars.
Going to Mars. Because I think you've already kind of just underlined a few of the maybe issues with Mars is that it's further away. It's more dangerous. And so it just seems like something that, I wouldn't have thought of happening in my lifetime. And it seems like it's something that's very possible. NASA in the past, 2 weeks, created oxygen out of the planet's atmosphere, right? That's wild.
Pretty cool.
It's flying mini helicopters around.
Yes.
And so, but it's also incredibly dangerous. And so I want to kind of look at a quote that Elon Musk actually said earlier this week in an interview. He said, honestly, a bunch of people will probably die in the beginning when speaking about the risks of colonizing Mars. And so I think on its own, this quote is, it's probably a pretty rational realization. However, when you couple it with SpaceX's Starlink's terms of use that essentially say or require parties to recognize Mars as a self-governing planet free of any earthbound sovereignty or laws, I think that might be a little more be a little more concerning because, there's a huge body of U.S. law that protects people from things that maybe a company would do to them, things like wrongful death, things like, criminal conduct and other sorts of torts that they might not expect and might not exist. And so I think besides going down maybe that rabbit hole, just asking the question, is it realistic to think that a company could create its own laws on Mars?
Yeah, so I struggle a little bit with that. And that, again, goes back to the outer space treaty. I know I'm being boring because I'm just reiterating myself. But again, a state is responsible for the actions of private entities.
Right.
And so I'm not so sure that Mr. Musk would be dictating the terms of the laws in outer space as much as countries and nation states would be doing that.
Yeah.
So is there a concern? Yes, and that's what we have to work through. It's like when we were building the ISS and we were trying to determine criminal jurisdiction for ISS. It was one of the more difficult topics because you have countries that have differing laws on how to handle criminal activity.
Right.
And then, like you mentioned, every module is the jurisdiction of all those different countries as well. So what do you do when there's a U.S. astronaut in a Japanese module and say the U.S. astronaut is hurt by a Japanese astronaut?
Right.
So who has jurisdiction over that? So what the ISS partners decided was to come up with an agreement ahead of time.
Okay.
And I think for Mars, you would probably want to do something similar, where you would have that agreement in place so people understand what are the rules of the road when you go up there. So for ISS, in that instance, we have jurisdiction over our astronauts no matter what module they're in. And in that instance, we would have jurisdiction over our astronaut. However, the Japanese would come and they would consult with us, and they would have the expectation that we would still ensure that that astronaut is punished under our laws. And if we don't have that astronaut punished under our laws, they have the right to come and ask for extradition of that astronaut to make sure that they're properly punished.
So somebody's making sure there's retribution.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, I mean that kind of answers my next question, because I was going to ask. I mean, we're talking about these celestial bodies, the moon, Mars, and it seems like there is some sort of law in place through the Outer Space Treaty and through what you all have kind of set into act with the ISS of like, but like that's all within areas at least that people have jurisdiction because they're modules. But what about if two astronauts are on the ground in Mars? You know, they're between modules. They're walking on the planet, and somebody crashes their rover car into somebody else's car, or, God forbid, murders somebody or steals something, and we're outside of that.
Yeah, so the Outer Space Treaty, I think it's Article 8 that talks a bit about jurisdiction. So if a state has an astronaut go on a spacecraft to outer space, they retain jurisdiction over that astronaut. That astronaut doesn't necessarily have to be from their country either. I guess the question that I would ask, though, then, they still retain jurisdiction over both the spacecraft and the people on the spacecraft. I would possibly argue that Article 8 still continues to apply, even when they're outside of the spacecraft.
Got it.
And then you mentioned spacewalks. Well, arguably too, is the spacesuit itself its own private little personal spacecraft.
So maybe not even an issue until we start terraforming planets.
Yes.
Interesting.
So then if you're in a spacesuit, you're staying within the jurisdiction of that country.
Okay.
But again, that is just grasping for
Right.
For
Yeah,
ideas.
we're surely in the hypothetical here.
That is purely hypothetical.
I guess the last hypothetical thought I have on Mars would be, you would think that there's always this risk, right, when we're going out and we're putting people on these planets, that it's going to become this, colonialization thing of like the 17th and 18th centuries, where people are just going and they're grabbing up land and they're grabbing up resources. And I think one of the things you talked about was, ice is going to become a major resource, not only for launching people from the moon to other planets, but I would assume to get back. Some people might not want to stay on Mars for life. And so, how do we prevent these companies and countries, I suppose, too, from like carving out planets and having dominance over these valuable resources like, ice or water?
Yeah. So I think following the Outer Space Treaty does cover a lot of that, and a lot of it is resource ownership, as we talked about. But I think also, as you mentioned earlier, you mentioned the Artemis Accords. And the Artemis Accords really is the beginning of a set of principles that the U.S. has put out there for bilateral signature with other countries. It's not this international legal framework regime, but it's more a set of principles that countries agree to follow while they're performing activities in outer space. So deconfliction zones there's 10 major principles of the Artemis Accords, one being deconfliction zones, where you're going to work with each other to make sure that the activities that you're doing deconflict with the activities that others are doing. As well as all the activities are going to be for peaceful purposes. So when you're talking about these big land grabs, additionally also that they're consistent with the Outer Space Treaty, all of these activities. So you can't do a land grab because, remember, Article 2 of the Outer Space Treaty says no national appropriation of outer space. So again, it's all of these countries agreeing to follow the major space treaties, as well as hopefully agreeing to some of these other norms that may possibly then be the beginning of a legal framework that can get set up to make sure activities like that are done for peaceful purposes and for the right purposes.
Yeah. And it sounds like we had some decent foresight in the 60s, but just now in modern days trying to tweak and modify those things to a degree, or maybe even not, maybe just clarify and interpret them, Yes,
I think a lot of it has to do with interpretation.
Yeah.
Yes.
Interesting. Well, I see we're running out of time here, but before we close, I need to ask one question that at least my dad would want me to ask, and that is, do aliens exist?
Well, I'd have to kill you if I told you.
Oh, there it is.
So
that's what he said you'd say.
Yeah. There's been stories of people seeing different things on space missions. Not so sure, but who knows? But what I would say about that is, wouldn't it be really neat for commercialization of space to be where you or your dad can take a family vacation to space and find that out for yourself?
And that's why we need more private companies getting into space to lower that $250,000 just a little bit. Just a little bit. Because, I mean, my family's thinking about going to Europe, but we haven't yet because it's pricey, so I can imagine.
But how cool would it be
that
you say, okay, instead of Disneyland spending $8,000, we're all going to space?
That would be amazing.
Yes, it would.
And we're starting to create the legal framework to make that happen.
Yes, absolutely. And we need more space lawyers as well.
Hey, and so for any of the listeners, me included, that's a call. That's a call to action. And I mean, what is? I guess we don't. I mean, I know you say closing question, but I'm kind of curious. How does somebody become a space lawyer? I mean, you've obviously done it, right? Is it what is NASA looking for when they're looking for a space lawyer?
So I think that goes just back to the areas of expertise that they need. Again, I would consider all the lawyers in my office space lawyers. We just all work in different areas.
Yeah.
But if you want to work for a place like NASA, government experience and a passion for NASA's mission.
Yeah.
And again, just an expertise in all those different areas I mentioned, anything from contracts to we do general law. We have employment attorneys, so IP attorneys. There are smart attorneys. So all those different areas of the law, we need people that have that expertise in our office.
That's really cool.
Yeah,
it's very interesting. I think for me, I am interested in space, but I also think to myself, this is going to become a $1 trillion industry in probably the next decade or so, and in being interested in corporate, I'm thinking they're going to need some transaction attorneys on the private side.
Absolutely.
Helping these companies grow, helping them acquire other companies. I mean, it's a big future market. It already is it's already a decent sized market in and of itself now.
Yes, absolutely. And in the past year, I've seen so many announcements for attorneys for private companies. So private space companies. So there will be, I think, a really big growing market for the need for, like I said, lawyers in the area of space and space law.
Very interesting. So I sidetracked from my closing question, so now I have a real closing question. Okay. And this is, if you had to guess, when do you think humans will step foot on Mars?
Oof, that's a tough one. I think it will be in my lifetime.
Okay.
But I think it might be maybe my kids or my kids' kids or maybe your kids.
So you'll get to be retired. You don't have to worry about those legal issues at that point.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I will pass that down to the next generation.
That's great. Well, thank you so much for being on the show, Rebecca. It's truly been a pleasure, and glad to have you.
Nice to be here.
Thanks for listening. Emphasis Added is a podcast by the Houston Law Review. If you like what you heard, subscribe to us on YouTube or your favorite podcast app, and follow the Houston Law Review on social media, or check us out on houstonlawreview.org. Till next time.